Hello and welcome to this Serial Geek TV episode commentary for A Fire Star is Born, an episode of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends produced by Marvel Productions. Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. Always love the opening titles with wonderful music of Johnny Douglas. What I love about the opening as well, it doesn't attempt to weigh you down with information. It's like, here's Spider-Man, here's Iceman, here's Firestar, they all live together. A fire monster attacks, their home can transform into a superhero lab facility and they go into action. As a kid, these transformation sequences, especially the Iceman one, I remember drawing over and over again on lined paper. I was so fascinated by the way Iceman would transform. If you go back frame by frame, it's a wonderful transformation. Also, I always thought it was interesting that Amazing Friends and the solo Spider-Man show, the syndicated Spider-Man show, focused on Doctor Doom as a villain, because he always struck me as obviously a Fantastic Four villain. This episode is written by Christy Marks, one of the best writers of the 1980s, the woman at the forefront of the Gem cartoon. Christy also worked for numerous other studios, but Marvel Productions seemed to be her home, as it were. First, I need to talk about the animation in this episode. So, for the most part, Meehan were Marvel Productions' go-to animation house for both Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends and the solo Spider-Man series. However, 4 episodes of Amazing Friends are animated not by Meehan, but by Toei Doga. Toei worked on many Marvel Productions shows like Dungeons & Dragons, G.I. Joe, Transformers. Their style is often instantly recognisable, not because they tick certain anime tropes, far from it, but because their animation has a real on-screen weight to it. Like when you see this sequence with Spider-Man stopping the bank robbers, Spider-Man just looks like a superhero. Also, rather than using the stock transformations, Toei created their own versions. And here we are with old Webhead. Toei, look how powerful he looks. He looks so strong. It reminds me very much of the John Romita Spider-Man, very powerful looking figure. Whereas the Steve Ditko Spider-Man was a teenager, had very little muscle definition. And then you go to the late 1980s, early 1990s with Todd McFarlane and Eric Larson, and their Spider-Man was very sinewy, did all these crazy poses. But yeah, Toei Doga seemed to adhere to John Romita's look of Spider-Man. And don't get me wrong, Toei were given model sheets, but obviously Marvel Productions knew what they wanted with their Spider-Man character. As a kid, I remember seeing Amazing Friends, and then a year or two later, the Secret Wars comic was released in the UK. And for a time, they had an Iceman backup strip in the UK comic. Me not realising that Iceman and Spider-Man weren't close friends in the comics kind of threw me, but it was cool to see that the comic utilised his ice bridge way of travelling, as did a certain character in the She-Ra cartoon. We'll get to that another time. Listen here, if you go back and listen to my commentary for the Incredible Hulk episode Enter She-Hulk, I talk about how Bob Holt, who was the voice actor for the Incredible Hulk, did these stock roars. So he would roar, and these roars would be peppered into the episodes when required. However, I mentioned that commentary that Marvel Productions also used those roars in other shows, including Dungeons & Dragons, Transformers the movie, and Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. I think even G.I. Joe as well.
Try wading through this.
And you'll hear the Juggernaut roaring like the Hulk. Actually, he does it throughout the episode when not given the utterly fantastic and underutilised voice of William Marshall. He's an absolute class act with a voice that commands. I just wish we could have heard more of him in animation. Actually, thinking about it, I think he would have made an amazing Unicron in Transformers the movie, but hey, look at these shots. The characters are so nicely illustrated by the Japanese artists. I can imagine those at Marvel Productions were always overjoyed when an episode worked on went to Toei Doga. We're going to Toei Doga? Yes!
Could we possibly talk this over?
I will destroy my stepbrother Charles Xavier and his juvenile band of X-Men.
Listen to that voice! Oh, that voice is so good, so commanding. Yeah, the Juggernaut origin story here feels a tad unnecessary, but I like that it's quick and to the point. So, I found this crystal, I became the Juggernaut. The animation here is so wonderfully smooth when you see Spider-Man doing those backflips and jumping onto things. Oh, also, yeah, I should mention that we're on a building site where many a Marvel battle seems to take place. I should also point out that New York City, a building site as well, is pretty quiet, but that's just the way it is in animation. In a movie, you can pay a bunch of extras to walk around, but in animation, you need to animate all those people fleeing. The same thing happens in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon, also set in New York City. Yeah, the characters are rendered with much more detail than in standard episodes. And if you see the characters in this episode, when they are stood still, they often look heroic, like really heroic. Toei also loved dynamic camera moves and angles. That said, there is an incredible camera move in a Mihan animated episode, but we'll get to that another time. And yeah, it would appear that Spider-Man is dead. Spoiler, he's not dead.
I'm coming for you, Charles Xavier. You and your X-Men are doomed.
And here we are with Professor Xavier, Storm, and the Angel. So yeah, let's talk about the X-Men. My main exposure to the X-Men as a kid was in Secret Wars, and in that they weren't really the nicest group. They were kind of the outcasts of the heroes. But yeah, roughly a year later, maybe 86, 87, I became a huge fan of the X Factor comic book written by Louise Simonson and illustrated by Walt Simonson, the great Walt Simonson. I was a huge fan of his run on The Mighty Thor. And the reason I liked X Factor so much was because it had the original lineup of X-Men. And yeah, I want to say it was X Factor issue 15, in which poor old Angel, who we see here, died, having had his wings stripped from him by the Marauders, I believe it was. This is a long time ago since I read those comics. Of course, this scene coming up with Wolverine is infamous.
Wolverine. How you doing? Want a piece of fruit?
Of course, I don't think it was lost on anyone that an Australian actor, Hugh Jackman, would end up playing a Canadian character that was once portrayed as an Australian. Actually, that reminds me, in the awesome Pride of the X-Men cartoon, also by Marvel Productions and Toei Doga, Wolverine is Australian in that. Did someone have something against Canadians at Marvel Productions? And now we get the flashback to Firestar's origin. And my one criticism of this episode is that it's a very detailed origin. It feels that much of it could have been trimmed down. I love this. When the snowballs hit her, early sign of her power, the snowballs just instantly melt. So cool. And Bonnie, her erstwhile enemy, as it were, is such a wonderfully horrific child. This episode really does showcase the warmth and love that the father has for Angelica. You know, Frank Welker, known for a plethora of crazy voices, here voicing the father with great age and wisdom. Right from the get-go, they really do paint Bonnie as this rich, spoiled kid. And yeah, I want to know what the script described this doll that Bonnie gives Angelica to look like. What did it describe it as? Because it's like a weird crow with a baseball hat and sneakers and jeans and it's yeah. I love how horrific everything melts there.
A jinx, Angelica! Angelica the Jinx! Miss Angelica Jinx! Miss Angelica Jinx!
From that day on, the kids all called me Miss Angelica Jinx.
Miss Angelica Jinx. That's actually a pretty cool name, I think. Oh yeah, I think, yeah, Jinx. There's a character, Jinx, who shows up in G.I. Joe the movie. Pretty cool character, if I recall. It's always nice to see these moments when characters explore their powers. We see it with the Iceman origin as well. I need to talk about Bonnie's voice for a second. It's perfect. And if it sounds familiar to some people, it's because she's voiced by Marilyn Shreffler, who was the voice of Olive Oyl in the first cartoon I ever remember watching as a kid, the all-new Popeye show. She would also reprise the role of Olive Oyl in Popeye and Son. She was clearly a talented voice actress, but left us far too soon, passing away at only 42 years of age. And if stories are to be believed, she was literally working into her dying days, so bless her.
I was very careful about using my power, but sometimes I couldn't resist.
Hey! Look at Angelica's fire!
And yeah, what's interesting about this episode visually as well is that Angelica and Bonnie would have had to have at least 3 different character models showing their progression of age, because we see them as kids, then as teenagers, and as late teens here in this formal dance.
Well, look who's dared to show up! Miss Angelica Jinx!
I love when Bonnie backs off. Look at the expressions of the other characters behind her. They're hilarious, big wide-eyed expressions, like they fear for their lives.
Oh, look! Something bad happened already!
It's funny you thinking about it. In both of the origins of Iceman and Firestar, they accidentally ruin parties with their powers. And yeah, I just want to give a quick shout out to Kathy Garver, who was the voice of Angelica Jones and Firestar. I always thought it was one of the best cast roles of the 1980s because Kathy Garver brought with her a real natural, genuine voice to that character. She felt that you look at that character and that voice just perfectly suits. You can't say that about every character, male or female, in the 1980s. I just think that Kathy Garver as Angelica Jones Firestar was just one of the best. It's just a shame that Kathy Garver didn't have more voice work in the 1980s. I do love this moment when she's trying to collect the papers that are blowing away in the wind and we see her trying to grab them, and the next minute the camera pulls back and she's flying. Okay, coming up is one of the most bizarre pieces of voice acting ever. Listen.
Angelica, why are you late?
Now, the voice of that teacher is so weird. One, she's British, and two, it doesn't even sound like she recorded the line in the same studio. Part of me thinks that maybe there was a TV show somewhere in some part of the world at some point, and the winner of a competition could voice one line in an episode of Amazing Friends, because to me that line sticks out like a sore thumb. Oh, and here we are on another building site. I'd like to think Harold Lloyd could have got out of this situation. And with her father's life at stake, we go to an ad break. And here we are back from the ad break, and one of the few issues I have with this episode, why is her father smiling in this shot? Who is hanging on for dear life smiling? This is a great scene for Angelica Jones, a real kind of moment in the evolution of her character, proving to herself that she can accomplish a great deal with her powers. Also, I like here that when she's using her heat power to kind of meld the steel girders together, she inadvertently causes the strap to break. Thus she has to quickly fly down and save her father. So yeah, she's still in the early days of discovering her powers. We see time and time again, especially in modern media, characters gain abilities and instantly have mastery over them with little to no issues. It makes these modern characters godlike almost. I do love her father's line here, be sure to listen.
Did you see him save my life? He was incredible!
I think that line is so perfect. He simply assumes that a guy, a superhero of sorts, saved his life, failing to realise that it was his daughter. This is done mainly to protect the father from the fact that his daughter has mutant abilities. Secret identities and all that make for very fascinating pieces, don't you know? But the assumption that his saviour is a male is beautifully highlighting that anything a male superhero can do, so too can a female high schooler. It kind of gives Angelica even more belief that she can accomplish anything.
Oh, come off it, Bonnie. We're too old for name-calling.
Don't talk to me like that, or you're not a cheerleader anymore.
And it's a nice touch to see that even Bonnie's friends at this point, her closest friends, are tired of the never-ending teasing of Angelica Jinx. Angelica Jinx. I mean Jones. Oh my goodness, I'm teasing her now. It's never really explained why Bonnie dislikes Angelica Jones so much, but I guess it comes down to the fact that she considers Angelica poor, a lesser class as it were. But now Bonnie has a new associate, her dopey boyfriend. I love his line here.
I don't want to go out with Angelica.
He's just so confused by the most basic of ideas. Also, Firestar's narration wonderfully points out that Bonnie was largely responsible for Angelica taking up her superhero identity in order to, as we'll see, prove her innocence. Another thing I really do love about this series is the attention to the fashion. Yes, of course, these clothes look dated, but they are a wonderful reflection of what people were wearing in the late 70s, early 80s. Actually, thinking about it, Firestar's origin here is set in the 70s. I never really thought about that before. This situation is interesting because it's not only the moment that Firestar is externally created by Bonnie, as Angelica will have to prove her innocence, but it's a very mean girl situation to watch unfold. The mean girl bullying the pleasant girl and getting her into a great deal of trouble. Though I do find it rather hilarious how quickly the Dean simply believes Bonnie and her boyfriend. Look at that close-up of Angelica Jones there with the sad eyes. It's a beautifully illustrated piece of animation. You'll see in a few moments' time another close-up. I'll point it out for a reason. Oh, Bonnie, you're so evil. The artists do a good job of showing that Angelica and her father do live in somewhat poor conditions with not much in the way of possessions. Like the name of the paper, The Student Times.
Miss Angelica Jinx suspected.
But yeah, I mentioned the previous beautifully illustrated close-up of Angelica. This close-up here, it looks like a pickup by another studio, as it doesn't really have Toei's style of line weight. It could be that Marvel Productions weren't happy with the shot and had it reanimated by another studio in a very short space of time, which happened a lot during the 1980s. And if you didn't hate Bonnie and her boyfriend enough already, not only are they rich high schoolers, live in huge houses, but Bonnie also owns a Porsche. It's like, gah. I just want to talk about the design of Angelica Jones for a moment. For those that don't know, the legendary John Romita, who had penciled the Spider-Man comic during the 60s and 70s and created the iconic Spider-Man artwork that we saw used on merchandise throughout the 70s and 80s, even into the 90s, he had actually contributed some design work to the development of Amazing Friends, particularly a very famous sketch of a female superhero called Heatwave, who looked a lot like Firestar without the mask. John Romita also illustrated the gorgeous network pictures for the show when it was known as Spider Friends. The most interesting aspect of his contribution is the design of Angelica Jones, who he designed in the image of his famous and character-defining take on Mary Jane Watson. In fact, not only is his design for Angelica based on Mary Jane, but the pose used in her development artwork and on the model sheet is the same as the incredibly famous panel of issue 42, I think it was, where Peter Parker stands stunned as we see Mary Jane for the first time. You know, the famous, "Face it, Tiger, you've just hit the jackpot." What is even more fun is that the same pose is used for Angelica Jones in the episode Origin of the Spider-Friends when Peter Parker sees her for the first time. The artists at Marvel Productions were such fans of the comic books themselves, clearly. I think villains falling into mud accompanied by a comedy sound effect is one of my guilty pleasures in cartoons of the 80s. Not that it happened in every other episode. I do love the music in this scene where Firestar catches Bonnie's boyfriend. And dumps him in the mud too. I'm sure somewhere out there, some far off corner of the internet, there's a really bad fanfic which details how Bonnie and Dave, I think his name is, how this moment had them become supervillains and attempt to overthrow the world. Maybe it's a fanfic I should write. And yeah, here we see Angelica Jones returning. And there's another great close-up coming up, definitely by the animators at Toei Doga.
Angelica, I owe you an apology.
I like the fact that Dean says, "I owe you an apology." You think? I do love this scene that takes place later in the evening because we get to see Angelica Jones almost at a crossroads in her life. She's used her powers, she's become Firestar, and now she's trying to figure out what to do. And at that moment, obviously, here come the X-Men. Her first meeting with Iceman. Also interesting to see her transform directly in front of him as well. There's a really great sequence coming up where Angel appears and then evades Firestar's heat ray there. That's a great sequence, beautifully animated again.
Good guys, follow me.
Congratulations, Firestar.
Here we see Cyclops, and look at the rendering on Cyclops, wow. In the comics he was supposed to be Slim Summers, as in he was skinny. Not quite there, it looks like he's been working out quite a bit. Cyclops growing up for some reason was one of my favourite Marvel characters. Again, Secret Wars, I just felt like he was so cool in that with his eye blasts. Oh yeah, and if you'd forgotten, we're 18 minutes into the episode, it's a Spider-Man cartoon. Again, that's my only criticism of this episode. It really delves into Firestar's origin, which, whilst cool, you feel that there could have been a bit more back and forth between the perils that Spider-Man is facing and the origin of Firestar. Reading the Daily Bugle? Because of course he is. Speaking of the Daily Bugle, it's such a shame that this series didn't utilise J. Jonah Jameson more. He appears a great deal in the solo Spider-Man show, but in that series we see Peter Parker working as a photographer for the Daily Bugle, so he appears in most episodes. I love these shots of the X-Men versus Magneto and then the Sentinel. Again, I don't think you get this if these storyboards aren't created by fans of Marvel Comics. God, look at Firestar's hair, it's awesome. I have a slight issue with this next moment. Watch the Juggernaut, right? Boom, smashes through. He smashes through the wall and we see rubble. However, It's clearly a wall that is covered in computer-based technology and equipment, so surely when he bursts through, it shouldn't just fall apart like a wall with chunks of rubble. It should explode with technology and stuff. And it's not like Toei skimped on animation. They were one of the best studios of the 1980s, so it's like, why did they make that decision? It's funny, as a kid I always remembered this shot of Storm blasting Juggernaut. I'm not sure if it's the awesome music, the cool effects, the cool sound effects. Look at this shot, it's really beautifully animated on 1s and 2s. Look at that. Juggernaut just bathed in electricity and he's able to resist. That's a great image, like really showcasing the power of the Juggernaut.
X-Men, follow my mental commands. Cyclops, Iceman, you will be the second line of defense.
I really like this scene because we get to see the X-Men really working together and just how incredible their powers are, or uncanny their powers are. I mean, this is ridiculous, like Cyclops just blasting a huge ditch in the ground. It's like, someone's going to have to fill that in at some point. Another minor issue I have with this episode is Cyclops' voice. It just sounds too over-heroic, like, I am Cyclops, we'd like you to join the X-Men. It's too much of that. Whereas in the season 3 episode, The X-Men Adventure, it's a more natural sounding voice, so much better. It's funny, over the years I've read articles where they talk about how in Amazing Friends, Wolverine never used his claws. He leaps at Juggernaut, he clearly takes a couple of swipes in before being thrown up into the air. I really don't like those two shots back to back where we see him do a backflip and the next shot he's just coming towards the camera. I understand what they were doing, but I feel like you need a reaction shot of the Juggernaut in between to break up those two shots. And of course we get the often used, we need to remove his helmet, which is the end to, I'm guessing, hundreds of Juggernaut stories. One of the things that Toei did better than most animation studios of the 1980s was they animated fire so beautifully. If you look at the fire here, then look at the introduction sequence to Dungeons and Dragons. It's so similar. There's a great scene with Professor Xavier and Spider-Man in the X-Men Adventure episode, in which the Professor is probing the minds of those around him and actually assures Spider-Man that he is not intruding upon Spider-Man's secret identity. It's a really great little moment. It seems a bit weird in this plot where, the X-Men themselves cannot stop the Juggernaut, so it's up to Spider-Man, Iceman and Firestar to save the day. It kind of makes the X-Men feel a tad useless, but I get what they're doing. It's the Spider-Man show. Although this probably was one of Dan Gilvezan's easiest voice days as Peter Parker Spider-Man, because he doesn't have much dialogue in this episode. And there we go, the removal of Juggernaut's helmet, so now it's on because Professor Xavier is going to do what he does. Look at the effects here when he unleashes his psychic powers. That is beautiful. That is fantastic animation.
Frozen!
We owe Juggernaut a toast.
We do?
Absolutely. Class reunions can be horribly boring. He made this one unforgettable.
Goodness, I think I'm in love with Firestar's hair. When you look at that lineup of X-Men, it is really unique. Cyclops and Storm, then you've got Angel and Wolverine. That's the X-Men in this episode. I feel like there should be 2 more or something, Nightcrawler and Colossus or something. Obviously they show up in the X-Men Adventure, so, although Wolverine gets the boot in that episode. And yeah, here we go, the end credits. Again, awesome talent involved on so many levels. You'll see here it actually states that Meehan are the animation studio that worked on this episode. That is not the case, I can assure you. And that's the end of this commentary. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, share and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.